Today, we're tackling a truly groundbreaking book, Carol J. Adams's The Sexual Politics of Meat.
Yeah, and it's now got that updated subtitle, A Feminist Vegan Critical Theory. And, this book isn't really just about food choices, like whether you eat meat or not.
Right.
It's this deep, often surprising exploration of how our whole relationship with meat and the systems behind it are tangled up with, really fundamental cultural ideas: gender, power, race, class.
And it's fascinating because it all started from a really personal, almost accidental moment for Carol Adams, the author.
Yeah.
She grew up around animals, apparently felt some early discomfort about eating them, but the real trigger, the catalyst, came later, after college. She'd just come home from divinity school, and she was grieving. Her pony, Jimmy, had just been shot.
Right, and it was in that moment of grief, thinking about her pony, that she actually took a bite of a hamburger.
Wow.
And she describes this like sudden force hitting her, the disconnect, the complete incongruity of mourning one animal while, casually eating another.
And that feeling was powerful enough that she knew right then she had to stop eating meat.
Instantly.
It sounds like a classic case of that feminist idea, the personal is political, but applied right there on her dinner plate.
Exactly. And from there, her path led her into this incredibly vibrant feminist scene in Boston and Cambridge in the 1970s.
Yeah, I've read about that time. Consciousness-raising groups, radical bookstores.
Totally. Influential thinkers.
Yeah.
And she remembers this specific moment, walking to Harvard Square, where all these connections she'd been vaguely sensing between feminism and vegetarianism just suddenly crystallized.
She uses this great metaphor like 3 cherries that click into place in a slot machine.
Yeah.
Thinking about historical feminist vegetarians, characters in books. The theory wasn't all worked out yet, but the link felt undeniable.
Right. And she actually tried writing an early version of the book back then in the 70s, but pulled it. So the theory wasn't quite there. It took another decade, really, shaped by her activism working on housing, anti-racism, anti-violence stuff, before she could write the book we know today. That activism, she says, made her see how different oppressions intersect, so the book wouldn't just be about gender.
Okay, so it evolved from that personal lightning bolt moment into this really developed theoretical argument.
Yeah.
And the absolute core concept, the thing you really need to grasp, is what she calls the absent referent.
That's it. That's the key. The absent referent is basically the way animals are made invisible in the whole process and act of eating meat. Adams points to 3 main ways this happens.
Okay, 3 ways. Let's start with the first one. How are they literally absent?
Well, literally, the animal is dead.
Right.
Meat exists because an animal was killed.
Simple as that.
But the living creature, the individual animal, is gone. It's replaced by, the steak, the chop, the burger. You simply cannot have meat without that original death, that violence, but the being it happened to. Absent.
Physically gone from the equation. Okay. And then you mentioned language. How does talk change things?
Oh, language is huge here.
Yeah.
Definitionally absent. We stop saying dead pig or dead cow.
Right.
We say pork or beef. Maybe animals become veal or lamb. Even the word meat itself acts as a stand-in, a replacement for the dead animal.
Kind of sanitizes it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then culinary language takes it even further, right?
Yeah.
Focusing on recipes, preparation, taste. It pushes the living animal further and further away. They become absent in how we define and describe the food.
Okay. Literal absence, definitional absence. And the third way is metaphorical. This sounds like where the sexual politics part really comes in.
Yes, this is incredibly powerful and central to her argument. Adams points out how we use the bodies or fates of animals as metaphors for human experiences, often experiences of suffering, degradation, objectification.
Like that common phrase, I felt like a piece of meat.
Exactly that phrase. Think about who usually says that and in what context. Often women, right? Describing feeling objectified, dehumanized, maybe vulnerable to sexual violence. But Adams's point is crucial. You cannot literally feel like a piece of meat. Meat is, by definition, something violently deprived of all feeling, all subjectivity.
Ah, right.
So the feeling of objectification is borrowed from the animal's fate. But the animal's actual experience, the violence that made it meat, is completely erased in that metaphor. The animal is the absent referent in the human metaphor.
So the animal provides the symbolic weight for the human feeling, but their own reality, their own suffering gets wiped out in the process.
Precisely. And Adams argues that this structure, this process of making the animal an absent, referent through objectification and replacement, says the very mechanism that links violence against animals to violence against women. It's how patriarchal values get embedded, get institutionalized in the culture through this shared structure of oppression.
That's a really striking, kind of disturbing connection. So how does the book show this playing out in, everyday culture and history? What are these texts of meat she talks about?
Right, the texts of meat. She's looking at how the meaning of meat is constructed culturally. Not just, protein and calories, but its symbolic power.
What it represents.
Exactly. These texts have a clear message. Meat is food, often seen as essential food. They pop up everywhere, mealtimes, advertising, casual conversation, and they exist within this whole system of production, attitudes, and crucially, sanctioned violence against animals.
And the argument is that this system, this meaning, is fundamentally patriarchal.
Absolutely. At its core, meat gets coded as male, as masculine. Vegetables, fruits, they often get coded as female or at least less masculine. It becomes less about simple preference and more about performing a certain sex role.
The sources you shared had some pretty stark historical examples, like old paintings.
Yeah, paintings depicting kings like Henry VIII chomping down on huge joints of meat while the women around might have fruits or lighter fare.
And those old meat industry ads.
Oh yeah, proclaiming meat as a virile and protective food, explicitly linking meat eating to virility, to manhood.
And the word virile itself comes from vir, Latin for man.
Exactly. So eating meat becomes a way to demonstrate, to perform masculinity. And this wasn't just symbolic. It had real consequences. Like in famine situations, the historical record shows men often got priority for meat rations, even when women, maybe pregnant, maybe nursing, had arguably a greater physiological need for protein.
There were even cultural taboos in some places, right? Specifically restricting women from eating certain meats.
Yes, lots of examples globally, which of course only serve to increase meat's prestige and desirability for men. It reinforces its status as this high-value, male-associated food. And conversely, you'd see accounts of men considering non-meat foods sort of effeminate or needing heavy sauces just to make vegetables acceptable.
And the book argues this isn't just ancient history. It carries through. Cookbooks with sections for men only about grilling steaks.
Right. Or that documented pattern, even in poorer working-class families historically, of the wife ensuring the husband, the main earner, got the lion's share of any meat available because he has to have it.
There were studies about this?
Yes, Dr. Edward Smith's survey, the Fabian and Women's Group study, and Cicely Hamilton's observation that women often did the carving precisely when there wasn't quite enough meat, managing the scarcity while ensuring the man got his portion.
You even see it in things like wartime rationing. Soldiers who are overwhelmingly male getting significantly more meat allocated than civilians.
It all points to the same cultural script being reinforced over and over.
Yeah.
Meat is fundamentally food for men, tied up with status, strength, power within that patriarchal framework.
Okay, so a really strong case connecting meat, gender, patriarchy. But the analysis goes further, linking it to race and colonialism too.
That's a really crucial expansion of the argument, yes. Adams suggests that this strong emphasis on hearty meat eating in Western cultures isn't just patriarchal, it's also deeply intertwined with racism. Specifically, how it helps maintain power structures that favor white people.
How does that work? It's not saying, like, racism against animals.
No, exactly. It's not that formulation. It's about how the consumption of meat and the assumptions around it reinforce existing racial and colonial hierarchies.
So the underlying logic is something like, if meat is limited, white people should get it. But if it's plentiful, then everyone should eat it, effectively imposing the white Western diet as the standard.
That's basically it. It sets up meat consumption as the norm associated with the dominant group, typically white, male, upper or middle class. And history provides some pretty blatant examples.
Like what?
Well, 19th century figures who explicitly linked eating lean meat with being a brain worker, which was basically code for middle-class white men, while associating plant foods, grains, fruits with savages, the lower classes, and significantly white women too.
Wow. So racism and sexism reinforcing each other to elevate meat as white man's food?
Precisely. And you also have that whole narrative linking meat-eating nations, the British beef eaters being the classic example, with their supposed inherent superiority and their ability to conquer and rule.
And then there's the really dark example of the charge of cannibalism used during colonization.
Yes, Adams discusses this powerfully, how European colonizers frequently accused indigenous peoples of cannibalism, often with little or no actual evidence.
And this wasn't just an observation, it was a justification.
Exactly. It served as a potent justification for conquest, for enslavement, for dispossession. It painted indigenous peoples as utterly savage, barbaric, for supposedly doing to humans what the Europeans were, in fact, doing to animals on an industrial scale, and often ignoring that many of these cultures had sustainable, largely plant-based diets.
That comparison really hits hard. The book also talks about milk, doesn't it? The imposition of dairy consumption.
Yes, another really important point related to colonialism. Mass consumption of cow's milk isn't a historical universal. It was largely spread through European colonization.
And many people around the world naturally stop producing the enzyme to digest lactose after infancy.
Right, they are lactose normal. But because European-descended populations are more likely to retain lactase persistence, this natural human variation in others got pathologized and labeled lactose intolerance.
As if something is wrong with them.
Exactly. The Food Empowerment Project calls that term itself a product of colonization. It frames the colonizer's diet as the norm and others as deficient. This ties into that broader idea of the colonial body, how diet was used to literally shape and conceptually categorize populations as superior or inferior based on what they ate.
So how does this connect to veganism today? Because sometimes you hear it dismissed as, a privileged white thing.
Well, Adams and other thinkers argue that modern veganism, far from being solely a white middle-class health trend, can actually be understood as a rejection of practices like industrial dairy farming that are deeply rooted in settler colonialism.
And the sources definitely emphasize the vital role of Black and brown communities in driving contemporary veganism.
Absolutely. Highlighting groups like the Atra Vegan Society, initiatives like Veganuary, the amazing rise of Black-owned vegan restaurants, thinkers like Bryant Terry. It's about reclaiming ancestral plant-based foodways, pushing back against those colonial dietary impositions. It's not rejecting culture. For many, it's reclaiming it. There's that great point about needing to normalize Blackness, to normalize veganism.
Okay, shifting slightly, but staying with the interconnectedness theme. Adams coins another term, feminized protein. What's that about?
Feminized protein is her term to specifically highlight the exploitation of the reproductive capacities and processes of female animals in agriculture. So milk from cows, eggs from hens.
Focusing on the female body as the site of production.
Exactly. It aims to make us confront the sexual commodification inherent in those systems. Industrial animal agriculture is completely dependent on controlling and exploiting female reproduction. One researcher, Catherine Gillespie, found a relentless, sexually violent commodification of the female body in these systems.
And Adams draws a direct parallel between this and the experiences of human women.
She does. She links this commodification of female animal bodies, framed by the absent referent concept, to the ways women's bodies and reproduction are controlled, specifically referencing the criminalization of abortion and the idea of compulsory pregnancy.
So the underlying structure of control over reproduction is similar, whether animal or human, within a patriarchal system.
That's the argument, that achieving and maintaining dominance or subject status often involves denying that status to others, including female animals and human women, primarily by controlling the reproductive lives.
The source material mentioned the Turnaway study.
Yeah, which clearly showed the significant negative health, social, and economic impacts on women who are denied access to abortion. It underscores the real-world consequences of losing reproductive control.
And the book connects this very directly to the post-Roe v. Wade situation in the U.S. after the Dobbs decision.
Incredibly relevant now, yes. There's that powerful image described from a protest postcard, a picture of a cow equated with the word livestock, with the text noting that livestock is the term for creatures not permitted to control their reproduction. The cow becomes the absent referent for the diminished status of women.
And the reverse side showed forced insemination, apparently.
Yes, driving home that parallel of forced reproduction. It argues that denying reproductive control essentially reduces a being, human or animal, to the reproductive function, stripping away full personhood.
And even the language used sometimes overlaps.
Disturbingly so. Adams points out how language in animal agriculture ads talking about an egg's dream being consumption, or manuals discussing culling cows who fail to get pregnant reflects this language of entitlement over female bodies and reproductive outcomes.
Almost echoing anti-abortion rhetoric.
It resonates with the logic of fetal personhood used by anti-abortion activists, which, as critics like Jamel Bouie have argued, can subordinate the actual existing personhood of a woman to the potential personhood of an embryo or fetus, framing that subordination as somehow protecting dignity rather than attacking the one's dignity and equality.
Okay, these are clearly very challenging, provocative arguments. What kind of reception has the book had over the years? It's been out since 1990.
Oh, the reactions have been, well, intense and varied. Everything from deep appreciation, people saying it changed their lives, to absolute fury and backlash. It definitely became what you might call an underground classic.
Showing up in unexpected places.
Yeah, like song lyrics by the band Consolidated. Or even an episode of Law & Order, SVU. Apparently, the episode Beef directly quoted Adams, saying things like, "Our society views women and animals pretty much the same as cuts of meat. And meat eating and the patriarchal world go hand in hand."
But there was significant pushback, too, especially from certain political quarters.
Absolutely. Rush Limbaugh was a major early critic in the 90s. He really latched onto the book as prime evidence of everything he disliked. Political correctness, feminism, or feminazis as he called them, vegetarianism.
Linking it all together as a threat?
Exactly. A threat to traditional values, traditional masculinity, even warning his listeners, quite literally, they're coming for your meat. He'd even ask listeners to call in if they found the book on college syllabi to prove how academia was being corrupted.
That story about the history professor hearing Limbaugh ranting about the book from a delivery truck radio is amazing.
It really shows the cultural reach of that backlash. And more recently, you see someone like Jordan Peterson kind of picking up that mantle. Well, with his strong anti-feminist stance, his attacks on what he calls ideologues and corrupt courses in universities, and then there's his very public adoption of what some call performative meat eating, like his all-meat lion diet. It functions as a signal, a performance of a certain kind of traditional flesh-appreciating masculinity.
There's that funny anecdote about the Oxford Union dinner.
Right, where he apparently made a point of ordering steak prepared a specific way, but then left half of it uneaten. It speaks to the performative aspect. And his comments on Joe Rogan's podcast, dismissing the book's arguments like, every hamburger is served with a side order of misogyny, as the absolute peak, the apogee of political correctness.
And this generated more online attacks.
Oh yeah, Adams received waves of misogynistic emails and online abuse after things like that. It really underscores the continuity of this angry backlash and how tightly it seems connected to anxieties about gender.
Which ties right into this concept the book discusses, aggrieved masculinity.
It really feels like a core part of the reaction. This intense, often anxious defense of meat eating, especially by some men, seems linked to a broader cultural sense that traditional forms of masculinity are under attack or being destabilized.
The book points to historical examples too, right? Like George Bush playing up the rancher cowboy persona, or the cultural shift towards hypervirility after 9/11.
Exactly. The idea is that in times of perceived instability or threat to traditional male roles, eating meat, this highly symbolic, male-coded food, becomes a defensive act, a way to shore up a shaky identity. As the book puts it, the presence of flesh foods at a meal functions to forestall further instability.
And you see echoes of this everywhere in culture.
All over the place. That French political debate about whether real men eat meat or grill bare-chested. Men's magazines constantly linking steak and grilling to winning or cultural testosterone. High-end department stores putting butcher counters in their men's sections. This whole new carnivore trend, which often seems framed as men needing to reclaim a shriveled birthright through eating meat.
And then there was that Burger King Manthem ad from years ago.
Yes, which depicted men feeling oppressed by salads and tofu, uniting to reclaim their right to eat meat. Some saw it almost as a harbinger of the kind of aggrieved male identity politics that became more prominent later.
And the flip side of this is the negativity directed at men who don't eat meat.
Absolutely. The ridicule, the slurs being called wimps, sissies, soy boys, that old playground taunt, vegan today, gay tomorrow, even sitcom jokes, like in Seinfeld, playing on the idea that a man might need to hide his vegetarianism.
So challenging the meat masculinity link feels threatening to that identity.
Deeply threatening, it seems, especially if that identity feels insecure. It leads to hostility, sometimes even targeting vegan businesses as part of broader culture wars. Adams argues, quite pointedly, that the sheer amount of energy poured into defending meat eating as somehow essential to identity proves that it isn't actually essential biologically or nutritionally. If it were, it wouldn't need such a loud, anxious, identity-based defense.
Wow. Okay, that brings us full circle. Stepping back from all these interconnected threads, what are the absolute key takeaways from this deep dive into the sexual politics of meat?
Well, I think the central argument is that meat isn't just food. It's a powerful cultural symbol deeply embedded in a patriarchal system. It's linked inextricably to hierarchies of gender, but also, crucially, to race and class.
And that concept of the absent referent is the tool, the lens, for seeing how the objectification and erasure of animals connects to the oppression of other marginalized groups, particularly women, but also people of color through colonial legacies.
Exactly. It provides a framework for understanding these overlapping systems of oppression. And importantly, the book positions vegetarianism or veganism not primarily as a health choice, though health benefits are acknowledged, but as an ethical and political stance. An embodiment, as Adams puts it, of one's beliefs against these interconnected systems of violence and domination.
Making the invisible visible through personal action.
That's the idea. And the fact that this book, first published in 1990, remains so relevant, continually in print, added to lists of books that changed lives, really speaks to the enduring power of these cultural structures and the insightfulness of Adams's analysis.
So you've just taken a deep dive with us into how something so seemingly ordinary, so every day what's on your plate, can be profoundly connected to these vast social, political, and historical forces of power, gender, race, and oppression.
Yeah, the sexual politics of meat isn't just a clever phrase or a metaphor. The book argues it's a real operating structure woven into our culture.
And thinking about that fierce, often anxious cultural defense of meat eating, especially the links to masculinity, if that's driven less by actual need and more by anxieties about shifting identities and power, well, it leaves you with a pretty provocative thought, doesn't it?
It really does.
What other things in our culture, things we take for granted as fixed or somehow essential, might actually be similar kinds of performances? Rituals designed not out of necessity, but to protect insecure identities or prop up established power structures.
And if challenging our deeply ingrained ideas about something as basic as food can reveal these connections, how might that open doors to questioning and challenging other forms of inequality and oppression in perhaps unexpected ways?
Something to definitely chew on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.